It was a quiet Friday evening, the kind that felt peaceful after a long week. The sky was fading from orange to deep blue, and the streets of Brookdale, a small suburban town, were calm except for the hum of cars heading home. The streetlights blinked on one by one, washing the roads with a soft yellow glow. Maya Thompson drove her silver sedan carefully along Maplewood Avenue. She wasn't in a hurry. She had just finished a long week of meetings in Atlanta and was finally heading home. The car radio played soft jazz, and for once her mind was at ease. She had promised herself that tonight she would rest, maybe call her younger brother, and forget about work for a while. Maya was in her late 30s, calm and thoughtful by nature. People often said she had a quiet strength about her. She didn't talk much about her job. Not because it was secret, but because she preferred to listen. What most people didn't know was that she worked as a special agent for the FBI. Her work focused on community outreach and investigations related to civil rights. She was respected among her colleagues for her professionalism and fairness. But that night, none of that mattered. She was just another driver heading home. As she turned down a quieter road, she noticed flashing red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. A police car was following her, its siren briefly chirping. Confused, she checked her speed. She was well within the limit. Still, she signaled and pulled over to the side of the road. She rolled down her window, turned on the interior light, and placed both hands on the steering wheel, exactly as everyone was taught to do. The cool night air drifted in. She could hear the faint rustle of leaves and the distant sound of a barking dog. The officer approached slowly. His flashlight beam danced across the back seat, the dashboard, and finally her face. "Evening, ma'am," he said, his tone brisk. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Maya kept her voice calm. "I'm not sure, officer." "Was I speeding?" He studied her for a moment, the light still in her eyes. "Your vehicle matches the description of a car involved in a robbery earlier tonight," he said. "Do you have your license and registration?" "Of course," she said. She moved carefully, narrating each motion. "My license is in my wallet, and my registration is in the glove compartment." "I'm reaching for them now." The officer gave a short nod. Maya handed over her documents. Her heart beat a little faster, not from guilt, but from the tension in the air. Something about his tone felt sharp, suspicious. She had dealt with police officers many times before through her work, and she knew when someone was on edge. Another patrol car pulled up behind the first one. Two more officers stepped out, talking quietly to each other. The sight made Maya uneasy. She took a slow breath and reminded herself that she had done nothing wrong. The first officer walked back to his car, leaving her waiting in silence. The radio still played softly, but she couldn't focus on it anymore. A few minutes passed. The second officer, a younger man, walked up on the passenger side, glancing inside her car. His expression was unreadable. When the first officer returned, his face looked more serious. "Ma'am, do you have any weapons in the vehicle?" "No, sir," she replied. "I don't carry any." "Step out of the car, please." Maya hesitated. "Officer, may I ask why?" "I've shown my ID and registration." He frowned slightly. "Step out of the car." She unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door slowly. The air felt colder now, the tension heavier. She stood by the car, keeping her hands visible. The officer asked her a few more questions. Where she was coming from, where she was heading, if she knew anything about a robbery nearby. Maya answered each one politely and clearly, but she could tell he wasn't really listening. His eyes kept narrowing as if he was searching for a reason not to believe her. Something inside her told her to stay calm, no matter what. Years of training had taught her that. "Officer," she said finally, her voice even, "I want to let you know that I'm a federal agent. My badge is in my purse. I can show you if you like." The officer seemed taken aback for a moment. "A federal agent?" "Yes," she said. "I work with the Bureau. You can verify it easily." But before she could reach for her badge, he spoke again, more curtly. "Keep your hands where I can see them." "Don't move." Maya froze. She wasn't sure why he was reacting that way. Her instincts told her that things were spiraling into misunderstanding. The other officers watched, unsure, whispering to each other. The air between them felt thick, like everyone was waiting for someone else to act first. Maya tried again, softly. "Officer, I'm cooperating. I just want you to confirm who I am. Please call your supervisor or check with the Bureau's local office. They'll confirm my identity immediately." But the tension didn't ease. The lead officer's breathing was shallow. His hand hovered near his belt. Maya didn't move. She kept her eyes steady on him. The scene had turned strangely quiet. Even the sound of crickets seemed to fade. After a few long seconds, the younger officer stepped forward. "Hey," he said quietly to his partner. "Let's just check her ID, it's fine." The older officer glanced at him, then back at Maya. The moment passed, and finally he exhaled. "Stay right here," he said sharply and walked back to the patrol car again. Maya stood beside her car, her heart racing. She didn't say anything. The younger officer stayed near the back of her car, avoiding her eyes. The whole thing felt surreal. She had done everything right, yet somehow it had still turned into a scene. A few minutes later, the radio from the police car crackled. She couldn't hear what was said, but the officer's expression shifted. He stepped out of his car, this time with a mix of surprise and discomfort on his face. He approached her again, his voice more careful now. "Agent Thompson," he said quietly, "I just confirmed your credentials. You're free to go. Sorry for the inconvenience." Maya nodded slowly, too drained to speak at first. "Inconvenience?" she repeated under her breath, but not loud enough for him to hear. He handed back her documents, and for a moment their eyes met. There was something in his expression, maybe guilt, maybe confusion, but he said nothing more. She got back into her car and sat there for a moment with her hands on the steering wheel. Her body felt tense, her chest tight. She took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. The younger officer lingered nearby, looking unsure whether to apologize or stay quiet. He finally said, "Ma'am, I'm sorry about the mix-up. Have a safe night." Maya gave a small nod. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady but distant. When she finally pulled away, the road ahead looked blurry for a moment. She blinked hard and focused on the streetlights ahead. The soft glow reflected off her windshield, almost comforting. As she drove, she kept replaying the encounter in her mind. How quickly a peaceful night had turned into something else. It wasn't anger she felt most. It was sadness. Sadness that after all her work, after years of trying to build trust between communities and law enforcement, she could still be treated like a suspect for simply existing in her own skin. By the time she reached home, the night had grown quiet again. The street outside her house was empty, lined with maple trees whose leaves rustled softly in the breeze. She parked the car, sat for a moment, and then turned off the engine. The silence that followed felt heavy, almost too heavy to breathe in. Inside her home, everything was in order. Neat, calm, familiar. She placed her badge on the kitchen counter and stared at it for a long time. The small piece of metal that symbolized justice and fairness now felt oddly distant. She poured herself a glass of water and sat by the window, looking out at the dark street. The same flashing lights from earlier seemed to echo in her mind. That night, Maya didn't sleep much. She kept thinking about what had happened, how easily things could have gone wrong, how fragile trust could be. And though she didn't know it yet, that short, tense stop on a quiet street was only the beginning of a much bigger story, one that would soon make headlines across the country and test everything she believed about justice, truth, and accountability. The next morning, the sunlight streamed softly through the curtains, but Maya barely noticed. She sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. Her mind was still circling the events of the night before. The flashing lights, the officer's tone, the tension that filled the air, none of it would leave her. She replayed the scene over and over, wondering if she could have done something differently. Maybe if she had spoken faster or called her credentials sooner, things wouldn't have escalated. But deep down, she knew it wasn't about what she did. It was about what the officer saw when he looked at her. Her phone buzzed. It was her colleague, Ben, calling from the Bureau's Atlanta office. "Morning, Maya," he said, his voice calm but curious. "You all right? You didn't check in last night." "I'm fine," she said after a pause. "Just a long drive home." But he could hear the strain in her voice. "You sure? You sound off." Maya hesitated, then finally said, "Something happened last night. I got pulled over. It didn't go well." Ben stayed quiet for a moment. "By who?" "I don't know his name. Local police. Said my car matched a suspect's. But it wasn't about that. It was about how he looked at me. How he talked to me. You know what I mean." Ben sighed. "Yeah, I do." Did he know who you were? Not at first. He only found out after he ran my information, and when he did, his whole tone changed. That's not okay, Ben said firmly. You need to report this. You can't just let it go. I know, she said quietly. I just, need a minute to think. After the call ended, Maya sat in silence again. She had always believed in the system. She worked inside it every day, helping to make it fairer, more accountable. But now she wasn't sure how she felt. Part of her wanted to move on, to forget. Another part told her that staying quiet would only let things continue. A few days later, she went into the local precinct to file a report about the incident. The station was small, the air filled with the faint smell of coffee and paper. The officer at the front desk looked surprised when she introduced herself. "You're with the bureau?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I just need to file a formal report about a traffic stop that happened last week." He nodded awkwardly and brought her some forms. As she wrote, she could feel eyes on her. The room had gone unusually quiet. She handed the papers back when she was done. "We'll look into it," the officer said, his voice polite but distant. Days turned into weeks, and Maya heard nothing back. No call, no update, no acknowledgement. It was as if her report had disappeared into thin air. Then one morning she got a call from an old contact, a journalist named Claire who occasionally worked on civil rights stories. "Maya," she said, "I heard something strange. A woman was pulled over last month by a local cop. Stories going around that there was some kind of altercation, and now the department's closing ranks. That wouldn't happen to be you, would it?" Maya hesitated. "Why do you ask?" "Because I think they're trying to cover something up. There's talk of missing footage from the dash cam. One of my sources said the video was lost due to a system glitch." Maya felt her stomach tighten. "The footage is missing?" "That's what they're saying," Claire replied. "You know how it goes on no video, no case." After the call, Maya sat at her desk staring at her computer screen, trying to process it all. Missing footage. That was no coincidence. She had seen too many similar cases to believe in technical errors. Later that afternoon, she decided to make her own inquiry. Using her bureau credentials, she reached out to the state's Internal Affairs Division and requested a review of the dashcam files from that night. The agent she spoke to said they'd get back to her soon. 2 days later, an encrypted email arrived in her inbox. The message was short. "File recovered. Confidential copy attached." She hesitated for a moment, then clicked play. The video showed everything: her car pulling over, her calm voice, her careful movements, and the officer's tone as he questioned her. The tension was clear even through the screen. Then came the moment when she told him she was an agent. His reaction was visible: surprise, confusion, a flash of something else she couldn't quite name. She closed the video halfway through. Her chest felt tight again. It wasn't just what had happened. It was the realization that they had tried to erase it. The next morning, she forwarded the footage to her bureau supervisor, along with a short note. "This needs to be reviewed. I believe there's been an attempt to suppress evidence." Within hours, her phone started ringing nonstop. Calls from the bureau, from internal affairs, even from local reporters who had somehow caught wind of the story. The situation was moving fast, and now it was out of her hands. By evening, her story was everywhere. Federal agent targeted in routine stop. Local police accused of concealing dashcam footage. The headlines were everywhere online, and the department's spokesperson scrambled to issue a statement, insisting it was all a misunderstanding. Maya didn't want attention. She didn't want to be on the news. But once the truth began to surface, there was no turning it back. People were asking questions, demanding answers. The next day, the police chief called her directly. His voice was strained but controlled. "Agent Thompson, I wanted to personally apologize for what happened. The officer involved has been placed on leave while we review the incident." "Thank you," she said politely, but her tone was flat. "But I'd like to know why the footage was deleted." He paused for a moment. "We're looking into that. It might have been a technical issue." Maya didn't believe that for a second. "I hope you find the truth," she said, and ended the call. That night, she sat on her porch, watching the streetlights glow in the quiet. Her phone buzzed nonstop with messages from reporters, colleagues, and even strangers. Some messages were supportive, people thanking her for speaking out. Others were harsh, questioning her version of events. She ignored most of them. She wasn't interested in fame or outrage. She just wanted accountability. As the days passed, the investigation deepened. The officer's background came under review and troubling details began to emerge. Complaints of unfair treatment, written warnings, and reports that had been quietly dismissed over the years. When Maya read the report, she felt a mix of anger and sadness. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about a pattern, a system that looked away too many times. One afternoon, she met with her supervisor in Atlanta. He looked serious as he handed her a folder. "The Bureau's opening a formal case," he said. "You won't be handling it directly. Conflict of interest, but it's moving forward." "Good," she said softly. "It needs to." He nodded. "You should also be prepared. Things might get rough. The department's union is already trying to frame this as political." "I figured they would," she said, "but I'm not backing down." He gave a small smile. "That's what I expected you'd say." That night, Maya returned home feeling exhausted. The whole thing had taken an emotional toll. Every day felt like walking through fog, uncertain, heavy. But despite it all, she felt something she hadn't felt in days. Clarity. She finally understood that silence was never neutral. Silence was permission. And she couldn't give that anymore. Over the next week, the case continued to grow in visibility. News outlets replayed clips from the recovered video, and community leaders began speaking out. It wasn't just about her experience. It had become a larger conversation about accountability, fairness, and the deep need for change. Maya tried to stay out of the public eye, focusing instead on her work and on maintaining her peace. But inside, she knew this was far from over. There were still unanswered questions: who had deleted the footage, who had tried to protect the officer, and how deep the cover-up went. As she sat one evening watching the news, her phone buzzed again. It was a message from an unknown number. "You think you're helping, but you're making things worse. Stop before it's too late." She stared at the message for a long moment, her heart pounding. Then she locked her phone and set it aside. For the first time in her career, she wasn't just fighting a case. She was part of one. And though she didn't know where it would lead, she knew one thing for certain. The truth had started to come out, and she wouldn't let anyone bury it again. Outside, the night was still and quiet. The same kind of quiet as that night on the road. Only now she wasn't afraid of it. She was ready for whatever came next. The following week felt like a storm that wouldn't stop. Everywhere Maya turned, someone was talking about the case. News channels replayed the footage again and again, showing the same few seconds where she calmly explained who she was, and the officer ignored her. On social media, people argued about what had really happened, some defending the officer, others demanding justice. Maya stayed quiet through it all. She didn't do interviews, didn't make statements, and didn't respond to messages. She spent most of her days at home, taking calls from federal investigators and writing reports. The whole thing felt strange, being part of a story instead of just investigating one. One morning, her supervisor called and asked her to come to the Atlanta field office. When she arrived, the atmosphere was tense. Everyone seemed to know who she was now. Some greeted her with warm nods, others avoided her eyes. Her supervisor met her in the hallway and led her into a conference room. "Close the door," he said quietly. On the table was a thick folder and a laptop. He looked tired. "Maya, we've completed the first round of the internal investigation," he said. "You need to see this." He opened the laptop and played a video. It wasn't just the dash cam footage this time. It was from another camera, one from a nearby building. The new angle showed more clearly how calm she had been and how aggressive the officer had become for no reason. As the video played, her supervisor spoke softly. "The department said they lost the footage, but it looks like someone inside their IT unit intentionally deleted the original file. We traced the deletion to one specific login, Maya sat still, staring at the screen. They deleted it on purpose? He nodded. Yes, and the system shows it was done the morning after the incident. Her chest tightened. She felt anger, but it wasn't loud or explosive. It was quiet, the kind that sat deep inside. Do you know who? He hesitated. We're still confirming, but we have a name. And it's not just one person. Someone higher up gave the order. This was organized. She looked down at the table, processing the weight of his words. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room felt heavy with silence. Finally, she said softly, "So it wasn't just about me being stopped. It's about what they were trying to hide afterward." He nodded again. Exactly. And now it's turning into something bigger. The Justice Department is involved. They're opening a federal inquiry. Maya leaned back in her chair. It was a strange feeling, knowing she was right but wishing she wasn't. As the investigation expanded, more details started to surface. Internal emails, complaints from other citizens, and even anonymous tips began to paint a picture of a police department with long-standing issues. For years, people had filed reports about unfair treatment, but somehow those reports never made it past the first level of review. Maya wasn't surprised, but it still hurt to see it laid out so clearly. The next few weeks were filled with interviews. She spoke with federal agents, internal affairs officers, and prosecutors. Each time she told her story, she kept her voice calm, steady, and factual. She didn't want sympathy. She wanted the truth to be undeniable. But while the investigation was gaining traction, not everyone was happy about it. Some people in law enforcement circles started whispering that she was exaggerating. A few even hinted that she was using the incident to push an agenda. One evening, she was walking to her car after work when a man she didn't recognize approached her. He wore plain clothes but carried himself like someone used to authority. "Agent Thompson," he said, his tone polite but cold. "You've made quite a lot of noise lately." She stopped a few steps away. "Just telling the truth," she said. He smiled faintly. "Sometimes the truth causes problems. Maybe you should let things settle." She didn't flinch. Justice doesn't settle. It either happens or it doesn't. He looked at her for a moment, then gave a short nod and walked away. She watched him go, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. That night, she sat by her living room window thinking about everything that had happened since that night on the road. The flashing lights, the fear, the silence, and now the noise that came after. Her life had shifted completely. The following morning, she got a call from Claire, the journalist who had first reached out to her. "Maya," Claire said quickly, "something's happening." The officer's internal file just leaked. It's worse than anyone thought. There are multiple reports of misconduct, all dismissed without review. Maya felt her pulse quicken. "Are you sure it's real?" "Positive," Claire said. "I've verified the documents. The public's going to see them soon. When they do, this whole case will explode." And she was right. Within hours, the story hit every major outlet. People were shocked to learn how many warnings the department had ignored. There were interviews with community members who shared their own experiences, stories that had been brushed aside for years. Suddenly, Maya's case wasn't just about one night. It was about a system that had failed too many times. The officer involved, Daniel Harkins, became the focus of national attention. His name was everywhere and his past behavior was under a microscope. The department tried to manage the situation, but the pressure kept building. A week later, federal prosecutors officially announced that charges were being filed, not only against Harkins for misconduct, but also against 2 senior officers who had tried to cover up the evidence. It was the first time in the department's history that something like this had happened. When Maya heard the news, she didn't feel triumphant. She just felt tired. Justice wasn't simple or clean. It was messy, slow, and often painful. That evening, her phone rang again. It was her supervisor. "You did the right thing," he said. "You spoke up when it mattered. The Bureau's proud of you." "Thank you," she said quietly. "I just hope it means something." "It will," he said. "Maybe not right away, but it will." As the days passed, the public's attention grew even stronger. People began organizing community meetings and marches, not in anger, but in solidarity. They spoke about trust, respect, and rebuilding what had been broken. One afternoon, Maya attended one of these gatherings quietly, standing in the back of a small park where neighbors had come together to talk. A woman recognized her and walked over. "You don't know me," the woman said, "but what you did gave people hope. My son went through something similar years ago, but no one believed us. Thank you for standing up." Maya smiled softly. "You don't have to thank me," she said. "I just did what anyone should do." But deep down she knew not everyone could. It took resources, connections, and courage that many people didn't have. That thought stayed with her long after the event ended. Later that week, she was called to testify in front of a federal committee. The room was filled with officials, cameras, and reporters. When she spoke, her voice was steady but full of emotion. "I've worked in law enforcement for over a decade," she said. "I believe in justice and I believe in accountability. But belief isn't enough. We need action, transparency, and humility from all of us." When she finished, the room was silent for a moment, then filled with quiet applause. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was sincere. After the hearing, as she walked outside, she saw a group of young trainees from the bureau waiting by the steps. One of them called out, "Agent Thompson, thank you for setting the example." She smiled, nodding politely before heading to her car. Driving home that evening, she finally allowed herself to breathe a little easier. The road ahead was long, and she knew this case was far from over. But for the first time in weeks, she felt that maybe, just maybe, things were changing. At home, she sat on her porch again as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was warm, filled with the sound of distant cicadas. She looked up at the sky and thought about how one simple moment, a stop on a quiet road, had started all of this. Sometimes justice began in the most unexpected ways. And while she couldn't undo what had happened, she could make sure it meant something. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and whispered to herself, "The truth always finds a way." And as night slowly covered the town, she knew in her heart that the hardest part was still to come, but so was the hope that change might finally follow. The courthouse stood tall against the morning sky, its stone walls catching the first light of the day. Reporters had already gathered outside, microphones in hand, cameras pointed toward the steps. They were waiting for the trial that had captured the whole nation's attention. Inside a quiet hotel room across the street, Maya sat at a small desk, staring at the cup of coffee she hadn't touched. Her lawyer had called earlier, reminding her to arrive early and stay calm. She didn't need the reminder. She had been preparing herself for this day ever since the night everything began. She looked at her reflection in the mirror. Her face looked tired but determined. She wasn't there to fight with anger. She was there to tell the truth. That was all she could do. A few minutes later, she put on her blazer, picked up her small notebook, and headed downstairs. The lobby was filled with reporters trying to catch a glimpse of her, but security kept them back. As she stepped into the car that would take her to the courthouse, flashes from cameras filled the air like lightning. When she arrived, the crowd outside was even larger. People held signs with messages of support, while others simply stood silently, watching. Some looked at her with hope, others with curiosity, and a few with disbelief. It was strange, she thought, to become a symbol when all she had wanted was fairness. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Rows of journalists filled the benches, their pens ready. The officers accused of misconduct sat on one side, their faces expressionless. On the other, Maya sat with her attorney and a few colleagues from the bureau. As the judge entered, everyone stood. The sound of the gavel echoed through the room, bringing silence. The prosecution began by presenting the evidence, the dash cam footage, the deleted files, the messages between officers. Each piece built a picture of what had really happened that night. They spoke calmly, step by step, showing how decisions had been made, how reports were changed, and how truth had been buried. Maya watched quietly as the clips played on the screen. Even though she had seen them before, they still made her heart race. The moments felt distant but close all at once, like watching someone else's memory, one that she could still feel in her bones. When it was finally her turn to testify, she stood and walked to the front of the courtroom. The room went silent. The prosecutor asked her to describe the night in her own words. She took a breath. "I was driving home from work," she began, her voice calm and steady. "It was late and the street was quiet. I noticed the flashing lights behind me and pulled over immediately. I followed every instruction just like anyone should. But no matter how calm I stayed, I could feel the tension in the air. I could feel that something was wrong." The courtroom was silent except for the sound of her voice. She continued, explaining how she had identified herself, how the officer's tone had shifted, and how she later discovered that the footage had been deleted. The defense attorney tried to interrupt several times, asking if maybe she had misunderstood the officer's behavior. Each time, Maya answered simply and clearly. "No," she said, "I understood exactly what was happening. I've worked with law enforcement for years. I know the difference between caution and bias." At one point, she looked over at the officer sitting a few feet away. He didn't look back. His eyes were fixed on the table in front of him. When her testimony ended, the prosecutor thanked her and asked one final question. "Agent Thompson, why did you decide to speak out publicly about this case?" She paused for a moment before answering. "Because silence allows the wrong things to keep happening," she said. "And because justice doesn't work unless it's for everyone." The judge nodded slightly, then dismissed her from the stand. As she walked back to her seat, a few people in the courtroom quietly wiped their eyes. Over the next few days, more witnesses came forward, experts, investigators, and even a few officers from the same department. Some were nervous, some confident, but their stories fit together like puzzle pieces. Each one added weight to the truth that had tried so hard to stay hidden. Outside, the media reported every detail. News anchors debated the case on television. Social media was flooded with opinions, and families across the country followed the story as if it were their own. It wasn't just about one woman or one officer anymore. It had become a question about what kind of justice people believed in. Maya tried to stay away from the noise. Every evening after court, she returned to her hotel room, turned off the TV, and sat in silence. Sometimes she read through her notes, sometimes she just watched the city lights through the window. The sound of traffic below reminded her that life kept moving, no matter how heavy the moment felt. One night, she received a message from a young woman she had never met. The message read, "I watched your testimony today. I was scared to speak about what happened to me, but you gave me courage. Thank you." Maya read it twice, then set her phone down. She didn't reply, but she smiled faintly. Maybe that was what made it all worth it, knowing that one voice could give others the strength to find their own. A few days later, the defense began their argument. They tried to paint the incident as a misunderstanding, a mistake made in the heat of the moment. They spoke about split-second decisions and confusion, but the evidence told a different story, one of choices made before, during, and after the incident, choices that could no longer be explained away. The courtroom watched as emails and texts appeared on the screen, messages between the officers and their supervisors. There were words about protecting the department's image and keeping things quiet. Each line felt heavier than the one before. By the end of the week, it was clear that the defense had little left to stand on. The facts were too strong, the cover-up too obvious. The judge announced that closing arguments would be held the next day. The air in the courtroom felt electric. Everyone knew the verdict would be historic. That night, Maya walked through the quiet streets near her hotel. The city lights shimmered on the wet pavement after a brief rain. She thought about how strange life was, how quickly one event could change everything. She remembered the sound of the officer's voice that night, the flashing lights, the fear she had pushed down, and now, all of it had become part of a case that might change the system she had spent her life serving. When morning came, the courtroom was packed again. The prosecutor spoke first, his voice calm and clear. He didn't use complicated words or dramatic gestures. He simply said, "This case is about truth. It's about what happens when power is used without responsibility, and how one person's courage exposed it." Then the defense spoke, asking the court to consider the pressure of the job, the mistakes that could happen in the field, but their argument felt thin compared to the weight of evidence and the clarity of Maya's story. When the closing statements ended, the judge thanked both sides and said the verdict would be announced in 2 days. The tension in the room was almost unbearable. Outside, the crowd was larger than ever. People held candles, sang softly, and waited. News crews stayed overnight, broadcasting live updates. The whole nation was watching. Maya returned to her hotel room that evening and finally allowed herself to breathe. The waiting would be hard, but she had done everything she could. She had told the truth, stood her ground, and trusted the process. Whatever came next, she would face it with peace. The next morning, she woke before sunrise and went for a walk. The streets were quiet, the air cool and still. For the first time in months, she felt a kind of calm she hadn't known since before that night. She stopped by a small park and watched the sunlight spread across the grass. In that moment, she realized something important. Justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about change. It was about making sure the next person wouldn't have to go through what she did. 2 days later, the courtroom filled once more. The judge entered, papers in hand, and everyone rose. The sound of the gavel echoed again. As the judge began to read the verdict, the room went silent. Every word carried weight, every pause felt endless. When the final sentence was spoken, a wave of emotion swept through the courtroom. Some gasped, some cried quietly, and some simply closed their eyes. Maya sat still for a long time, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't smile, didn't cry. She just let the moment wash over her. It was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. When she finally stepped outside, the sunlight hit her face and the crowd erupted in cheers. She looked around at the people, strangers, supporters, families, and felt a quiet gratitude. The road to justice had been long, painful and uncertain, but standing there, she knew it had been worth every step. She whispered softly to herself, "Truth always wins in the end." And as she walked away from the courthouse, the weight she had carried for so long began to lift, replaced by something lighter, hope. The sound of applause outside the courthouse grew louder as Maya stepped out. The sunlight hit her face, and for a moment she just stood still, breathing it all in. Reporters shouted her name, cameras flashed, and microphones reached toward her. But she wasn't thinking about any of that. She was thinking about what it meant to finally have the truth out in the open. Her lawyer walked beside her, whispering something about speaking briefly to the press. She nodded quietly and stepped up to the podium that had been placed near the courthouse steps. The crowd fell silent, waiting for her to speak. She looked out at the sea of faces, young and old, people of all races, families holding small signs that read "Justice for All." Her voice was calm but strong as she began. "I stood here months ago as a victim," she said. "Today I stand as a reminder that truth can survive even when people try to bury it. This isn't just my story. This is our story, because what happens in silence affects us all." The crowd listened closely. Some people nodded, others wiped away tears. "I didn't come here looking for revenge," she continued. "I came here for accountability. I came here because every person, no matter who they are or what they look like, deserves to be treated with respect and fairness. Justice doesn't belong to a few. It belongs to everyone." Her words carried a quiet power. She didn't shout or point fingers. She simply spoke from her heart. When she finished, she thanked the people who had supported her and turned to walk back inside. Reporters shouted questions, but she didn't answer. She had said everything that needed to be said. Later that evening, news stations across the country replayed her speech. It was on every channel, every social media platform, every radio talk show. People discussed her words in living rooms, cafes, and classrooms. For once, the conversation wasn't just about anger. It was about understanding. In the days that followed, the story took on a life of its own. Some called it a victory for justice. Others saw it as a turning point in how law enforcement would be held accountable. Lawmakers began talking about reform, about better training, about stronger systems to prevent bias. For the first time in years, change didn't feel impossible. But for Maya, it wasn't about politics. She had spent her entire career believing in fairness and truth, and now she just wanted peace. She returned home quietly, avoiding interviews and cameras. Her neighbors left flowers on her porch, and letters poured in from people she'd never met. Teachers, nurses, students, even officers from other departments who wrote to say they were sorry for what she had gone through. Each evening, she would sit on her porch with a cup of tea and read a few of those letters. Some made her cry, others made her smile. One note from a retired officer said, "I spent years afraid to speak against what I saw. You gave me courage to tell the truth." Another from a high school student said, "I want to work for the FBI one day, just like you. Thank you for showing me that doing the right thing is never wrong." Those words meant more to her than any headline. Still, the trial had left deep marks, not just on her, but on everyone involved. The officer who had been sentenced faced the harsh reality of his choices. His family avoided the cameras, trying to move on quietly. Maya didn't feel anger toward them. In fact, she often thought about them, wondering how they were coping. She had never wanted to destroy someone's life. She just wanted honesty. Weeks passed and life slowly began to settle again. The FBI held a private ceremony to honor her bravery. It wasn't publicized, but those who knew her understood how meaningful it was. Her director handed her a small plaque and said, "You stood for justice when it wasn't easy. That's what this badge is supposed to mean." Maya thanked him, but her mind was elsewhere. She wasn't thinking about awards or recognition. She was thinking about the people who never got a chance to speak up, those whose stories ended before they could be told. That thought stayed with her. One morning, she decided to do something about it. She reached out to a few community leaders and started a small foundation. Its purpose was simple: to help families who had been wronged find the support they needed, legal, emotional, and financial. It wasn't a large operation, just a few volunteers at first, but word spread quickly. Donations started coming in, and within months, the foundation became a real organization. She called it the Bridge Project, because as she explained during an interview later, we need bridges, not walls, bridges between people, between truth and understanding, between pain and healing. The first event they held was in a community center, filled with folding chairs and homemade banners. People shared their stories, not with anger, but with hope. Some spoke about losing trust in the system, while others talked about second chances and forgiveness. Maya sat quietly in the back, listening. For the first time since the trial, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: lightness. Maybe healing wasn't about forgetting what happened. Maybe it was about using the pain to build something better. As months went by, the media attention around her began to fade, but the impact of her story remained. Documentaries were made, students wrote essays about her case, and activists used her journey as an example of courage and resilience. She didn't watch most of it. She preferred the quiet now, long walks, reading books, spending time with her family. But every now and then, she would receive another letter, sometimes from someone she had never met, sometimes from people who had followed her story since the beginning. One of them said, "You reminded us that justice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers, but it never goes away." One afternoon, she was invited to speak at a local university. At first, she hesitated, unsure if she was ready to stand in front of a crowd again. But she eventually agreed. The auditorium was packed with students eager to hear her story. She didn't bring notes. She just spoke from memory. "I'm not here to talk about anger," she said. "I'm here to talk about responsibility. We all have a choice, to look away or to face what's wrong and try to fix it. I faced something painful, but I also saw how powerful truth can be. If you remember one thing from me, let it be this: justice isn't an idea. It's an action, and it starts with each of us." When she finished, the audience stood and applauded. Many lined up afterward to thank her personally. Some said they wanted to go into law enforcement to make it better. Others said they wanted to work in policy or community service. As she drove home that evening, she thought about how different her life had become. Before all of this, she had been just another agent working quietly, following the rules. Now her story had become a lesson, one that reminded people what courage looked like in real life. That night, she sat on her porch again, watching the sky fade into twilight. The air was cool, the world calm. She thought about how far she had come, from fear to strength, from silence to voice. Her phone buzzed with a message from a journalist asking for another interview, but she didn't answer. She didn't need to. The story had already been told, not by her words, but by her actions. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear children playing, the sound of laughter echoing through the neighborhood. It was a small thing, but it made her smile. Life, she realized, always finds a way to move forward. She whispered softly, "This is what peace feels like." And for the first time in a long time, she truly believed it. Months had passed since the trial ended, and life had slowly started to feel normal again. The noise, the headlines, and the constant questions had all faded into the background. The world had moved on, but for Maya, the memories still lingered, not as pain anymore, but as quiet reminders of how far she had come. The mornings were peaceful now. She woke up early, made a simple breakfast, and sat by the window with her tea, watching the sun rise over the trees. The calmness of the moment always brought her comfort. There was something healing about the silence, something she hadn't felt in years. Every so often, she still received letters and emails from people she didn't know. Some shared their own experiences, others just thanked her for speaking up. She read each one carefully, always humbled by how her story had reached so many hearts. One afternoon, as she sorted through her mail, she found a small envelope with no return address. Inside was a handwritten note that said, "Your courage helped me forgive. Thank you for reminding me that healing is possible." She smiled as she folded the note and placed it with the others she had kept in a wooden box by her bed. That box had become a symbol of everything she had endured. Not the pain itself, but the strength that had come from it. In the months after the verdict, she had continued her work quietly. The bridge project she started was growing faster than she expected. Volunteers from different states reached out, offering their time and skills. Law students helped families understand their rights. Counselors offered support to those still struggling to trust the system again. It wasn't a big organization, but it was real, and it was making a difference. Whenever Maya visited the center, she was greeted by smiles and stories, people who had once felt powerless now finding a way forward. One woman told her, "You didn't just change your own story, you changed mine too." That sentence stayed with her for days. The media no longer followed her every move, but that was fine. She preferred it that way. Fame had never been her goal. Change was. And now she could see it happening little by little. New policies being discussed, communities talking about fairness, even police departments beginning new training programs focused on empathy and awareness. One day, she was invited to speak at a national conference on justice and reform. At first, she hesitated. She had already shared her story so many times that she wondered if she had anything new to say. But something inside her told her to go. When she arrived, the auditorium was full of officers, lawyers, students, and community leaders. As she walked to the stage, she noticed that people weren't just looking at her as a victim anymore. They were looking at her as a leader. She began her speech softly, without notes. "A lot of people ask me if I've forgiven what happened," she said. "The truth is, forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means refusing to carry hate in your heart forever. It means making space for something better, for growth, for understanding, for peace." Her voice remained calm and steady as she continued. "We can't fix the past, but we can learn from it. Every time someone chooses honesty over fear, compassion over judgment, or courage over silence, we take one step closer to the kind of world we all deserve." When she finished, the room was silent for a moment, then filled with applause. Some people stood, others simply nodded with tears in their eyes. Afterward, many came up to her, shaking her hand and thanking her. She could tell that her words had reached them, not because they were perfect, but because they were true. Later that evening, as she packed her things in her hotel room, she sat by the window again, watching the lights of the city below. She thought about how much had changed since that night, how she had gone from being a target of injustice to being a voice for fairness. She hadn't planned any of it. Life had just taken her there, one hard step at a time. Sometimes when she thought about the past, she still felt a small ache, not of anger, but of sadness for what had been lost. But then she would remind herself of everything that had been gained: truth, accountability, and hope. A few weeks later, she visited a local high school where students were learning about civil rights. The teacher invited her to speak to the class. She walked in quietly, not expecting much, but the students greeted her with excitement. One of them, a shy girl sitting in the front row, raised her hand and asked, "Did you ever feel like giving up?" Maya smiled softly before answering. "Many times," she said. "But giving up means letting fear win. And fear only grows when we stop standing up to it." Another student asked, "How did you stay strong when things got hard?" She thought for a moment and said, "Strength isn't something you wake up with. It's something you build, little by little, every time you decide to do what's right instead of what's easy." The students clapped, and the teacher thanked her for visiting. As she walked out, a young boy handed her a drawing he had made, a picture of two hands reaching toward each other with the words, "Truth connects us," written above. She smiled and told him she would keep it forever. Back home, she placed the drawing on her wall near her desk. Every time she looked at it, she was reminded of why she kept going, not for herself, but for the people who believed that one person could still make a difference. As the years went by, her name appeared less and less in the news, but her influence lived on quietly through the people she had touched. The Bridge Project expanded into several cities. And many of the young people she had met went on to become lawyers, activists, and community leaders. Sometimes, she would get invitations to big events or television interviews, but she rarely accepted them. She had found peace in the quiet moments, gardening in her backyard, spending evenings with her family, and helping others without the spotlight. One evening, as the sun began to set, she sat outside with a close friend. They talked about life, about how unpredictable it could be, and how much they had both changed. Her friend said softly, "You know, you've become a symbol for something bigger than all of us." Maya smiled faintly. "Maybe," she said, "but I don't want to be a symbol. I just want people to remember that justice is possible, and that it's never too late to do what's right." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sky turn from orange to pink to deep blue. The air was cool and the sound of crickets filled the night. Before going inside, she whispered to herself, "The fight for fairness never ends. It just changes hands." In the days that followed, she continued her quiet work, mentoring young agents, helping local families, and speaking whenever she was invited. Her story had begun with pain, but it ended with purpose. One morning, she received a letter from a young woman who had just joined the FBI. The letter read, "I joined because of you. I want to make sure what happened to you never happens again. Thank you for being brave enough to speak." Maya read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in her box with the others. She didn't cry. She just smiled and whispered, "That's all I ever wanted." Later that day, as she walked through her garden, the sunlight fell through the leaves, warm and gentle. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling grateful, not for the struggle she had endured, but for the strength that came from it. She had learned that justice wasn't just a word written in books or spoken in courts. It was a promise, one that required courage, patience, and compassion to keep alive. As she sat on the bench near her flowers, a soft breeze brushed her face and she thought about everything: the fear, the truth, the hope, the people she met along the way. Every moment, good or bad, had led her here. And sitting there, surrounded by peace, she finally understood what it all meant. Justice wasn't about winning. It was about making sure others didn't lose their voice. It was about reminding the world that even when the system fails, humanity doesn't have to. She looked up at the sky, smiled, and whispered quietly, "We did it." And in that quiet, golden light of evening, she knew that her story had come full circle. Not as a tale of pain, but as a message of strength, faith, and the unbreakable power of truth.